All right, I'm going to talk about margins today. What are margins? Margins are expenses in terms of revenue. So there's three main ones that you may have heard of. There's the gross profit margin, your operating profit margin, and your net profit margin. So let's start with those, and then I want to talk about some other margins as well and when those might come in handy, because any expense can be basically turned into a margin analysis, and it comes in handy at different times. So your gross profit margin is going to be your revenue less your cost of goods sold, and that's divided by your revenue. Okay, so your gross profit is your revenue less your cost of goods sold. And then when you divide that by your revenue, you get your gross profit margin. Okay, let's talk about some components there. Revenue, for our purposes, is the money you take in from customers for selling your product or service. Cost of goods sold is going to be the cost directly, and this is why they're called direct costs, of producing your product or service. So there's direct costs and then there's indirect costs. Indirect costs are spread across the business as a whole. Direct costs are direct costs of making that product or service. So let's say you make tennis balls. What are your direct costs of producing each tennis ball? Well, you've got your costs of your rubber and felt. I'm sure tennis balls, they don't call it being made out of felt, but I just don't know what the heck you call the fuzzy stuff. You've got your costs of those products that you've got to incorporate, and then you've got your labor. What does it take to operate the machinery that makes the tennis balls? So each tennis ball is made by a person operating machinery using materials that you've bought in order to make your tennis balls. So that's kind of your cost of goods sold. Revenue less those costs of goods sold, you can figure out, okay, what's your gross profit margin? And if it was as simple as you just made one product or service, you would figure that out you would figure out your gross profit, and that would be what is the cost of making each of those tennis balls. So if all I made was tennis balls, I could take my gross profit margin, divide it by the number of balls I made, you know exactly what it costs to make each tennis ball. But the gross profit margin in general, it is, what's your revenue less your cost of goods sold. Okay, move on down. Next one, operating margin. So your operating profit is, you're going to take your gross profit, which we just talked about, and then you're going to subtract out your G&A expenses. Okay, so G&A expenses, general and administrative expenses, are going to be all those costs that are spread across your company. So that could be, the salary of your marketing team, because they don't make a specific product, but their salaries pay for marketing for across your company. It could be your attorney's fees and your CPA fees. They aren't directly related to any specific item, but they are spread across your company. Your insurance expenses, your rent, your bank fees. So these are indirect costs. Direct costs, cost of goods sold, those are what are directly associated with making your products or making your or doing your service. And I should have said this earlier, with direct costs, those costs of goods sold, they go up proportionately to your revenue and how much product you're selling. So, in my tennis ball example, if you sell 100 tennis balls, your gross profit margin should go up significantly if suddenly you sell 1,000 tennis balls. So you've increased your sales tenfold. Your cost of goods sold, and I'm going to qualify this in a second, should go up about 10 times, because there are direct costs that's directly associated with the revenue that you're producing from the revenue you're creating from the goods or service you're providing. So I said they go up direct. I'll get into that in a little bit, because that's not exactly true. But get back down to operating expenses. Again, operating expenses, you take your gross profit, and then you subtract out your indirect costs, your G&A expenses, which I went into. That's your operating profit margin. So gross profit margin tells you, okay, here's what it takes to produce the goods or service that we're doing. Operating profit margin, that tells how much it costs you to run your actual business, basically. And then for most businesses, operating profit margin is going to be very similar, if not exactly the same as your net profit margin. But net profit margin takes into account other income or other expenses that aren't related to your core business, let's call it. So that could be, if the business owns real estate and you get extra rental income. Well, that's not associated to your business, but you're leasing part of your building to the guy next to you. Well, that comes in your other income. Other expenses, in our business, we do some work in other countries. Our foreign exchange expense is down there. So it's just kind of that income and those expenses that aren't core to your business, let's call it. And then that will determine your net income, and you divide the net income by your revenue. That's your net income profit margin. Okay, so now that we've kind of explained all of them, let's go into them in a little depth. What can you tell from margins? Let's start in general. This is kind of across the board. Well, if your margins are decreasing, something, and it's not intentional, and we'll get into that in a little bit, something is probably wrong with your business, okay? If your gross profit margin is, 25%, and in 2019, you look up in 2020, nothing's really changed, but your gross profit margin is 21%, something is probably wrong, and there could be a number of reasons for that. So one could be mismanagement, and that's something you need to look into. If you're running more labor than is necessary, if you are buying more supplies than are necessary and you're incurring waste, your cost of goods sold are going to go up. And that's just the reality of running a less efficient business, and that's a function of management. You got to make sure that your gross profit margins aren't decreasing because you're taking your eye off the ball and you're not managing effectively. So that could be one reason that your gross profit margins are going down. Another one could be that your your cost of goods sold are just going up due to some inflationary pressure. So what could that mean? Well, is it a hot labor market? What happens in a hot labor market? It costs more to hire people and wages go up. If your wages go up and your revenue's the same, well, that is going to drive down your gross profit margin. Same with your cost of goods sold, the materials that you use to make a product, if that's what you're doing. So in my tennis ball example, say my felt, again, or whatever you call it, and rubber costs are going up. My gross profit margin is going down. So I've got to keep an eye on that, because that is indicative of something is being mismanaged in my business. So again, one of it could be mismanagement. One reason for gross profit margins going down could be mismanagement, and the other could be that the cost of materials are going up. So what's the solution if that's the case? Because that is a sign that my business is not getting healthy, is getting less healthy. Well, let's examine each of those. If it's mismanagement, you need to have better P&L reviews. And P&L reviews are a monthly thing that needs to happen in your business with everyone who has a direct impact on those P&Ls. So in a large business like ours, we have, specific managers that manage P&Ls for each of our locations. And we have a P&L review with each one of them so we can see how is their business going this past month, how is it going this year, how is it going in the last 12 months, how is it going in the last 3 months. And we look at that to try and get a sense of the health of each of our locations. If you're a smaller business and you have one location, your location, then you need to have everyone who has P&L responsibility, meaning a manager who's responsible for the financial condition of that location, in a monthly P&L review meeting so you can see where your margins are. And again, if your gross profit margin's going down, it could be that there's just mismanagement. More labor is being used than necessary. More overtime hours are being run that's necessary. Or it could be the costs of materials that you're putting into your goods. You need to know what that is. Say it's not mismanagement. It truly is the cost of materials. You're not running too much labor. You're not using too many materials and having a lot of waste. And let's say it's outside the manager's control. That means there's some inflationary pressure that's going on. Either wage rates are going up or materials are going up. Something to that effect. Okay, what do you do then? That's a signal that you need to raise your prices in order to maintain your margins. And, at first, you sit there and go, my customers are not gonna go for that. Well, your business is gonna go out of business if you don't have these conversations with customers and charge more. So it could be easy, right? Like in my tennis ball example, if the tennis ball, let's cut out middlemen for a second, and let's say that the store that's selling the tennis ball is the store that's making the tennis ball is also selling it, which never happens, but let's just keep it simple. Well, they got to raise the price on the on tennis balls on the shelf. So if they were $1 for 3 and costs go up 10%, you've got to, in order to keep margins the same, you've got to increase pricing by 10% and pass that along to the customer. Now, let's talk about it in reality. I'm a factory that makes tennis balls. I probably sell those to a distributor like a Dick's, Academy, pick the sporting goods store in your location, or I sell them on Amazon, whatever, through distributors. That's my distribution channel. I've got to have it put into my agreement that, look, when the price of tennis balls goes up, your price goes up as well. And, however you do that in the agreements you sign, is going to depend on the business. Maybe those prices are checked monthly, maybe they're checked quarterly, maybe they're checked annually. If you're the manufacturer, you're the person providing the service and charging the fee, you want to be able to increase your costs more often, and you want to provide for that contractually. Now, let's say you are locked into a crappy contract in something you're doing. Here's some contract advice. What should you do? Well, number one, we all look at contracts and then we immediately, including me, because I'm a recovering lawyer myself, it's easy to sit there and wonder what a court's going to do. But the vast majority of contracts and contract disputes, if you think about it, they're never handled in a court. They're handled by the parties who want to keep a relationship with each other and want to make money with each other, continually negotiating about what is appropriate in the contract. So say I had something in my tennis ball contract and I was selling to Dick's and I didn't say anything about raising prices. Am I stuck? No. I would need to go to Dick's and say, guys, my cost is going up and my margins are going down. I can't have that. And a company like Dick's or Walmart or, Academy, whoever, they're going to drive you down hard on pricing, particularly if they get, high volume discounts. Walmart's notorious for that. But they also want their suppliers to be financially healthy. And my experience is whenever you're open and honest with someone and you tell them, look, prices went up. Here's, my evidence for that. I got to raise the price, to keep my margins consistent. They'll understand that for the most part, and even if they hem and haw in the process. And candidly, if that's not the case, you've got a bad business partner. Now, the likelihood of them not hemming and hawing also is going to have to do with their ability to control their pricing to their customer, the end customer. Sticking with the tennis ball example, okay, if prices go up by 10%, what can Walmart do? Well, they can just change the pricing on the shelf to, $1 for 3 tennis balls to $1.10, increase it by 10%, or whatever it needs to be increased in order to make sure that they're not making any less money. So ultimately, a lot of, your ability as a manufacturer or a service provider to control your margins by increasing revenue, that depends on the power of the ultimate distribution channel, whether that's you doing it directly with your customers or your distributors being able to do it with their customers. And you've got to at least think about this up front when you're doing contracts to make sure that you understand, what is the ability to raise prices on the end customer. Because if there is no ability to do that, but you have a lot of risk of your cost of goods sold going up, that's a major problem, okay? So margins going down for your gross profit margin are a major problem. What about your gross margin going up? So on one hand, that's going to be great, because if your gross profit margin goes up, that's going to track to the bottom line, assuming your G&A expenses aren't increasing at the same time, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But, you have an opportunity, because if your gross profit margin goes up, or you have a decision to make rather, because if your gross profit margin goes up, your net profit margin is going up as well. And for every $100 you make, you're going to get to keep more of it. So, yay, you could just put that in your pocket, have an extra distribution, obviously pay a little more tax to Uncle Sam. But one of the things that you need to think about always when your margins go up, and this is true of any margin, is, are you making extra distributions to yourself at the expense of your market share? And here's what I mean. If your gross profit margins are going up, it's probably because either labor's getting cheaper or the cost to procure your goods are going down. That could be because you're buying more goods and you're getting volume discounts or something. If you don't pass that along, at least some of it, it doesn't have to be 100%, but if you don't pass a good portion of that along to your customers, what you will find over time is that you leave yourself open to competitors coming in and underbidding you. In my tennis ball example, so if my cost of goods sold go down by 10% and we're still selling tennis balls for $1, well, on one hand, that's good. Like, let's say it cost me, let's say I had a 25% gross profit margin. So that means that for that dollar's worth of tennis balls, it's costing me 75 cents to produce. And again, let's forget about middlemen fees and stuff like that, just distribution fees and stuff like that. Well, if it goes down 10%, and I'm not gonna be able to do that math in my head, that extra $7.50, I can put that in my pocket, make an extra $7.50 per can of tennis balls that I sell. Okay. But if I'm selling those to Walmart and they're ultimately selling them to the customers and I don't pass along any of that, there's probably going to be one of my competitors, because it's probably not just me making tennis balls. Tennis balls are certainly a commodity, although there's obviously brand names. But Walmart, if another my competitor comes along and says, hey, I'm going to give it to you for 65 cents instead of this other guy's charging you 75 cents, or say more likely they'd say, I'm going to give it to you for 70 cents. Well, I'm now making it for about $67.50, because now I got those 10% savings off the 75 cents that I was originally charging. Because remember, again, and that math was confusing and I explained that terribly. Dollar that I'm selling the tennis balls to, selling the tennis balls for 25% margin, gross profit margin. That means I'm making it for 75 cents, and I cut that by 10 cents. That means now I'm making it for $67.50. Well, if I'm still selling it to Walmart, who's selling it to the customer for 75 cents, and someone comes along and sells it for 70 cents, I could lose out on that business, right? And now I'm selling nothing to Walmart. And now I have a bunch of labor, a bunch of machinery that's sitting idle. That's a major problem. What I should have done is taken a good chunk of that 10% savings and preemptively passed it along to Walmart and other customers in exchange for additional business. So I should have gone to other stores where I'm not selling and tried to pass along those savings to get more market share. Perhaps I should have gone to Walmart and asked to reduce my price in exchange for them allowing my tennis balls in more stores. There's a number of ways you can do that, but one of the things you need to do is when you increase your margins is think about how much of that you want to pass along in exchange for market share, or at least to protect the market share you got against not getting undercut by other competitors, because there is almost always going to be other competitors in your market. Now, let's talk G&A expenses for a minute, okay? And this is operating profit margin. A general concept is your operating profit margin should go up over time because you should be getting scale. So in my tennis ball example, remember my G&A expenses that, so you take your gross profit margin and then you subtract your G&A expenses. Those are the indirect expenses that are spread across the whole company, and you come up with your operating profit. Divide that by revenue, you've got your operating profit margin. So as I grow, if I'm selling 100 tennis balls to Walmart or whoever, and I've got a person in marketing, I've got a person in accounting, a person in HR, well, their salaries is kind of a fixed cost that I've got to deal with. But if I'm selling 1,000 tennis balls, now their salaries are spread over a bunch more revenue. Now, it's not like you can just keep your G&A expenses consistent no matter what your revenue is, because as you add revenue, as you add customers, as you add production, you are going to have to hire more people. You are going to have to pay more in legal fees, accounting fees. You may have to buy another building or incur more rent to rent another building. You may have to buy more machinery. There's a lot of additional G&A expenses that are going to come along with growing your business, but it's not one for one like cost of goods sold. And again, just so I remind myself, cost of goods sold are not technically one-to-one, and I do want to get to that before I finish this, and hopefully I remember. But back to G&A expenses. As you increase, as you get scale, those G&A expenses are going to go down over time. Here's a good example. So when Amazon started, Amazon was a book sales company, essentially. And what they did was they said, hey, we're going to get access to all these books through used booksellers, through direct distribution, put them in warehouses, and we're going to compete with your Barnes and Nobles, your Borders, and all those traditional bookstores. And obviously they did that quite effectively. Well, they did a ton of marketing up front, particularly in Google searches when Google came online, and that's kind of how they drove that business. Well, their marketing was a huge part of their overall expense structure. In fact, up front, it was probably their largest expense. And it was not in proportion to how much they were selling, because they started marketing like crazy right away with investor money, even when they weren't turning a gross profit. I'm sorry, they were probably turning a gross profit, but it was probably it was before they were turning an actual net profit. For years and years, they weren't turning a net profit, in part because their marketing expenses were so high. Well, Amazon could have turned a net profit very early on by reducing their marketing and reducing their other G&A expenses. I bet as soon as they kind of got to be the number one bookseller in the world, they could have been immensely profitable right then and there. And I don't know exactly what year that was, but it would have been in the 90s. Well, they chose to add additional service lines and sell additional products. And then that's when they did a lot more selling through Google and other channels, online advertising and other advertising. And now they're the company they are today, which is essentially, I believe, the largest company in the world. Well, if they had cut their G&A expenses early, yes, they would have been turning a profit, but they never would have got as big as they are. So that's, kind of a thought process in margins, in operating margin, that you have to do. The general rule is your operating margin should decline as a percentage of your revenue. Your operating expenses should decline as a percentage of your revenue over time, and that means your operating margin should be going up, all things being held equal. But it may be that you don't turn an operating profit, and that's intentional. But even with Amazon, I haven't researched this, but I'd have to guess that their negative operating margins were decreasing over time as they grew, because their increase in revenue was starting to cover their marketing expenses. So that's an example. But your traditional business, look, if in my tennis ball example, my gross profit margin is 25%, maybe my net profit margin is 5% in any given year, because my G&A expense, if I'm selling my can of tennis balls for $1 and my gross profit margin is 75%, so it cost me 75 cents in direct cost to produce that, maybe I've got another 20 cents per can sold in indirect cost, G&A expenses spread across the whole company, and I have a 5% gross profit margin. Well, if that's what it's like when I'm selling 100 balls, by the time I'm selling 1,000 balls, I better have increased my net profit margin. Now, how much you increase it, same deal with gross profit margin. If my gross profit margin increases because I'm getting labor savings, or if I'm getting a reduction in the price of my goods to produce my product, I better be passing off a lot of that to the customer. Otherwise, I'm taking short-term profits in exchange for long-term market share, and that's not a way to run a business. So in terms of running your margins, your operating margin, you've got to think in terms of, how can you make yourself more efficient over time, but also how much of those efficiency savings is prudent to pass along to your customers in exchange for more market share. Because ultimately, more market share is going to lead to higher revenues, which is going to decrease your overall G&A expenses and lead to higher margins. But that's not going to happen if you temporarily drive up your profit margins at the expense of market share. So again, when your margins go down, something's being mismanaged, or costs are going up and you have to increase your pricing. But when margins go up, yes, that's great, because you should be able to put more in your pocket, but you've got to figure out how much of that you need to pass along to your customers in the form of cost reductions or better products in order to, get more market share. So Apple may say, look, we're not really going to reduce prices, but what we're going to do is we're going to put a lot of those extra profit margins as we get scale and we get more revenue and our margins increase. We're going to reinvest that into R&D or buying other companies. And that's going to make better products and better services. And we're going to pass those along to the customers in order to get more market share. So market share doesn't necessarily need to come from just reducing costs. It could come from having a better product or a better service. But I will tell you, if your cost to your customer remain the same and the quality of your product or offering stays the same or declines, yeah, your margins may go up temporarily, but you're going to be out of business in the long run. So that's an important thought process that you should be going through in terms of maintaining margins, is figuring out, okay, are my margins staying the same? And if not, what's wrong? And if they're going up, why is that? And should I be passing that along to the customer, either in the form of reduced pricing or better quality products or services? And that is a strategy aspect that you, the business person, are going to have to determine for yourself. But that's a general concept of how margins are going to play into that. And I'm going to go into, because I reminded myself twice, I said that direct costs generally go up as you sell more of a product. So as I sell more tennis balls, my cost of goods sold should go up proportionally. So remember that my cost of my tennis balls is $1, or I'm selling my tennis balls for $1. The cost of producing them is 75 cents. If I'm selling 100, well, I should be selling that for $100 of revenue. If I'm selling 1,000, that's $1,000 of revenue. So theoretically, that 100, it should cost me $75 to produce, and the 1,000 should cost me $750. But that's not exactly true, because as you increase your market share and as you bring in more revenue, your costs of goods sold should go down somewhat. You should get more efficiencies with your labor pool, and you should manage towards that. And you should get volume pricing with your materials. Again, if I'm selling 100 tennis balls, maybe I don't have to buy that much rubber, and maybe the rubber costs me 25 cents per tennis ball. Well, if I'm doing 1,000, if I'm buying 10 times as much rubber from the company, you better believe that they're going to give me a discount. And so that should drive my cost of goods sold down. So just like anything else, I need to incorporate that into my margins, and I need to think again strategically about how much of that do I want to pass along to my customers in the form of price reductions or quality increases, and how much of that do I want to keep. So that's just, a general theory of margins and what you should be thinking about as you monitor margins. You should be monitoring your margins on a monthly basis, seeing where it compared to next month, on an annual basis, seeing how 1 year compared to the next, and then also on a rolling 12 basis, because you may find different things with different margins. For instance, like if your business is highly labor intensive, in a month with 30 days, you're going to incur less labor costs than a month with 31 days. And so your margins may change a little bit there, especially if you're selling for a fixed monthly price. Your margins may change on the month to month because of short-term fluctuations in the price of your supplies. There could be a variety of reasons, but you need to figure out what makes sense for you. If your margins should be the same month after month after month, then comparing 1 month to the next is real important. For us, we look at them, mainly on a rolling 12. So every month I look at what's the last